The first cruel thing I ever said about Edran Vale, I said to his face, and he did not so much as blink. We were 3 weeks into the summer rotation on the West Colonnade, the long stretch of pale stone where the tourists press closest to the railings, and the heat came off the flagstones in waves you could see. I was 19. I had been a guardsman of the Royal House of Harrogate for exactly 4 months, which is to say I knew nothing and believed I knew a great deal, and Corporal Edran Vale had the post beside mine. He was older than the rest of us, 35, maybe more, though his face gave nothing away. He stood the line the way a doorframe stands, without effort, without complaint, without any sign that standing cost him anything at all. The rest of us shifted our weight when the sergeant's back was turned, flexed our locked knees, blinked the sweat out of our eyes. Vale did none of that. He was simply there, and then he was there an hour later, and the flies that landed on the other men's collars seemed to know better than to land on his. I hated him a little for it, the way you hate anyone who makes the thing you find hard look easy, and because I was 19 and stupid, I decided the reason he found it easy was that there was nothing behind his eyes to trouble him. A man who feels nothing does not struggle to show nothing. That was my theory. I shared it freely. "You know what he is," I said to Pell one evening in the barracks, loud enough to carry down the row of bunks. "He's furniture. They wound him up at the coronation and he's been ticking ever since. A ceremonial guard. Decoration. You could put a wax dummy in that tunic and the tourists wouldn't know the difference." Pell laughed. Pell laughed at everything I said in those days, which is the only excuse I can offer for how much of it I said. Down the row, Vale sat on his bunk with a cloth and a tin of polish, working the toe of his boot in slow circles, and he did not look up, and he did not answer, and I took his silence for proof. That was the shape of it, those first weeks. I need you to understand the shape before I tell you how it broke, because the breaking is the whole of this story, and it will mean nothing if you do not first believe how completely I had him wrong. Let me tell you about the colonnade, so you can see where we stood. The Harrogate Palace does not open its inner courts to the public, but the West Colonnade runs along the outer wall, and the crowds come to it the way water comes to a low place. They come with cameras and folded maps and small folding stools, and they line the iron railings 6 deep on a good day, and they watch us. That is the arrangement. We stand our posts in the red wool and the tall black bearskins, with the white gloves and the polished medals and the rifles at the order, and they watch us not move, and they photograph our stillness, and they go home and tell their neighbors they saw the famous guards who never flinch. Most of them are kind, or at least indifferent. But a crowd is a crowd, and every crowd carries a few who cannot bear to be ignored. They come to the railing with something to prove. They shout. They wave their hands an inch from your face. They tell jokes at your expense and wait, grinning, for you to laugh, and when you do not laugh they tell a crueler one. They think, because you will not react, that you cannot. They think the stillness is stupidity. I understand the mistake better than most, because I made it myself, standing right beside the man who would eventually teach me otherwise. The sergeant who had charge of us that summer was a square, gray man named Corliss, who had stood the same posts 30 years before, and had opinions about all of us that he rationed out 1 syllable at a time. He liked Vale. That much was plain even to me. When Corliss inspected the line, he lingered a half-second longer at Vale's post, and the half-second was not suspicion. It was something closer to a salute he would not permit himself. I noticed it and misread it, as I misread everything then. I thought Corliss was fond of Vale the way a man is fond of an old, reliable tool. I did not think to ask why a 30-year sergeant would stand a fraction straighter beside a corporal. I should tell you what Vale wore, because it matters, and because I looked at it every day for weeks and saw nothing. His tunic was regulation, his bearskin regulation, his gloves regulation. His medals were the standard set a guardsman earns by simply not disgracing himself for a decade, the long service ribbon, the jubilee, the small honors that mean a man showed up and did his duty and was not caught doing otherwise. Nothing there to catch the eye. But below the metal bar, tucked so far under the edge of the tunic's facing that you would have to know to look for it, there was a small enameled pin. Gray. Only gray, no color to it, a little device shaped like a slim lance laid across an open hand. I saw it 100 times. I thought it was a bit of unit fancy, a squadron token, the sort of thing older men keep from postings that meant something only to them. I never asked. Why would I? It was gray. It was small. It caught no light. I have thought a great deal in the years since about how the most important thing in a man can be the thing that catches no light. The first real provocation came on a Thursday, and it came from a man I will call the Loud One, because I never learned his name and would not use it if I had. He was broad and pink and sweating through a very expensive shirt, and he had a phone on a little stick that he held out in front of him, and he had an audience, not the crowd, but a small knot of his own companions, laughing men who had come to the railing already half decided to make sport of us. He started small. He stood in front of Vale's post and made faces. He crossed his eyes and let his tongue loll and looked back at his friends to be sure they were watching. Vale stood, eyes forward, and gave him nothing, which of course only fed the man, because the whole point of a performance is the reaction, and a wall gives you none. "Say something," the Loud One said. "Go on, one word, I'll pay you." He waved a note over the railing, folded lengthwise, and flicked it so it fluttered down and settled on the flagstone at Vale's feet. "There, bought and paid for. Now dance." Vale did not look at the note. He did not look at the man. His gaze went out over the crowd to the line of plane trees beyond the outer road, the way we are trained to hold it, and the note lay on the stone between them like a small white insult, and the Loud One's friends laughed and told him to try harder. I was 2 posts down, and I confess I enjoyed it. Not the cruelty. Even then I knew the cruelty was ugly, but the confirmation. Here was proof of my theory. The furniture did not react because the furniture could not. I stood in my own stillness feeling superior to Vale for being unable to feel superior to anyone, which is the kind of not only a 19-year-old can tie in his own head and call it wisdom. The Loud One escalated. He always would have. Men like him do not know how to stop, because stopping would mean admitting the wall had won. He leaned over the railing as far as he could and put his sweating face a hand's width from Vale's and said, in the wet confidential voice of a man who thinks he is being clever, "You're not even real, are you? You're a costume. My daughter has a nutcracker on the mantel with more life in it than you. Ceremonial." He said the word like it was the filthiest thing he knew. "That's all you are, a ceremonial guard, a toy they wind up for the tourists." And here is the thing I remember most, the thing that has stayed with me all these years and started, though I did not know it yet, the slow work of dismantling everything I thought I understood. Vale's expression did not change, not a muscle, but his eyes for the smallest fraction of a second, so brief I would have missed it if I had not been looking directly at him, waiting to enjoy his defeat. His eyes moved, not to the man, past him, out to the crowd and the trees and the far gate and the rooflines beyond, a single unhurried sweep, the way a man reads a room he has already decided is safe. It was not the look of someone who feels nothing. It was the look of someone who has spent years learning to feel everything at once and give none of it away. I did not have words for it then. I only felt, for the first time, a small cold doubt, like a draft under a door I had thought was sealed. Then the moment passed. The Loud One got bored, as they always do when the wall will not fall, and he retrieved his folded note off the ground with a great show of contempt and wandered off with his laughing friends, and the crowd reformed around some other spectacle, and Vale stood his post as if nothing had touched him. Because, I would learn, nothing had. A man does not flinch at being called a toy soldier when he has stood in places where the word soldier meant something the Loud One could not have survived 1 hour of. That night in the barracks I did not repeat my furniture joke. I do not know exactly why. Something about the way his eyes had moved had lodged in me sideways, like a splinter you cannot see but feel every time you close your hand. I lay in my bunk and watched him across the room. He was cleaning the same boot, or a different boot, always some small precise task done exactly right. And I found myself wanting, obscurely, to ask him something, and having no idea what. Pell had no such trouble. "Furniture put on a show today," he said, grinning at me across the gap between our bunks. "Old Loudmouth really gave it to him. Ceremonial guard," he snorted. "That's a good one. Toy they wind up for the tourists. Where'd you get that?" "I don't know," I said, which was a lie. I knew exactly where I'd got it. I'd made it up 3 weeks earlier, standing sweating on the colonnade, deciding a man was empty because I could not see what filled him. "Well, it's true," Pell said, and rolled over, and was asleep in a minute, the way the young and the untroubled always are. I did not sleep for a long time. Across the room Vale set his boot down, aligned it precisely with its partner, turned off his lamp and lay back, and even in the dark, even lying down, he had that quality of a man at his post. Ready. Not tense, ready. As if some part of him never fully stood down, had not stood down in years, would carry to the grave the habit of a place where standing down got men killed. I did not know any of that yet. I am telling you the ending and the beginning because it is my story too, in a small and shameful way, and I would rather you know from the start that the man doing the mocking grew up to be the man telling you he was wrong. The morning it all came apart began like any other. Gray light, the flagstones cool for an hour before the heat found them, the first tour groups filing up to the railings with their cameras and their maps. Corliss walked the line at the change of watch and lingered his half-second at Vale's post as he always did, and I watched him do it and thought, again, that I did not understand it, and this time I let the not understanding stay open instead of filling it with a joke. We had word that morning that there would be visitors of rank. That happened from time to time, a foreign delegation, a retired officer come to see the old ground, some person of consequence who wanted the tour the public did not get. It changed nothing about our posture. We stood the same for a king as for a tourist, that being rather the point. But it put an edge in the air, a small formality, and Corliss inspected our buttons twice. The visitor came at mid-morning, walking the colonnade from the north end with 2 aides and a member of the palace staff who did the talking and the gesturing and the "this way if you please." He was a tall man, straight-backed in a plain dark suit that fit him the way a uniform fits a man who has worn one all his life. Gray at the temples, a face like weathered stone, seamed and still, the kind of face that has spent decades keeping its own counsel. He walked slowly, not out of frailty but out of attention, looking at each thing as if it might matter, and the palace staffers' practiced patter slid off him unheard. I did not know who he was. None of us did then. We only knew he carried himself like someone the whole apparatus of the place had quietly braced for, and that Corliss, our square, unmovable Corliss, had straightened at the sight of him in a way I had never seen Corliss straighten for anyone. The visitor was Colonel Thorne Havard, though I would not learn the name for another hour, and he was walking slowly, attentively, straight down the line toward the post where Corporal Edran Vale stood in the sun, a ceremonial guard, a toy wound up for the tourists, a piece of furniture, exactly as I had said. He would stop at that post. He would look at that gray pin no bigger than a thumbnail, the one I had seen 100 times and never once asked about. And in the space of the next 10 minutes, everything I thought I knew about the man beside me, and a good deal of what I thought I knew about courage and silence and the cost of both, would come apart in my hands. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me slow down and take it as it happened, because it happened slowly, and the slowness was the terrible part. The crowd that morning was thick and restless. The heat did that to them, made them impatient for something to happen, some spectacle to justify the standing and the sun. And on that particular morning the crowd carried a particular man, and I have to describe him, because he is the one who lit the fuse. He was younger than the loud one from the Thursday, but cut from the same coarse cloth. Sharp clothes, sharper voice, the restless energy of a man who measures every room for who is watching him and finds the answer never quite satisfactory. He had come to the railing with a phone already recording. You could see the little red dot on the screen, and he had come plainly to make something happen that he could show to strangers later and be admired for. He worked the crowd first, playing to the people around him, cracking small jokes about the guards, getting the easy laughs. Then he settled in front of Vale's post, because Vale was the stillest of us, and stillness is the greatest provocation to a man like that. I will call him the influencer, because that is what he announced himself to be, loudly, more than once, as if it were a rank. "Watch this," he told the people around him, tilting his phone to catch both his own face and Vale's. "This is the famous ceremonial guard, trained for years, to do nothing, to stand there like a mannequin while grown adults pay to look at him. Say hello to the guard, everybody." A few uneasy laughs. Most people at the railing shifted, the way decent people shift when they sense cruelty warming up and would rather not be part of it but do not quite have the nerve to leave. The influencer got closer to the railing. "Do you even hear me?" he said to Vale. "Blink if you can hear me. One blink." He waved his free hand back and forth an inch from the bars. "Nothing. Incredible. They've bred the human right out of him. This is what your taxes pay for, folks. A very expensive statue that breathes." And Vale stood, eyes forward, giving him the trees and the far gate and nothing else. And I stood 2 posts down feeling that cold splinter of doubt again, sharper now, because I was watching a man do to Vale exactly what I had done, and hearing my own joke in a stranger's mouth, and it did not sound clever anymore. It sounded small. It sounded like something you say about a person because you are afraid of what you would have to feel if you understood them. The influencer, getting no reaction, did what all of them do. He escalated. "You know what I think," he said, leaning so far over the railing that a steward near the wall started forward and then thought better of it. "I think ceremonial's the polite word. I think you couldn't hack the real thing. I think they gave you the pretty red coat and the fuzzy hat because you weren't good enough for anything that mattered. The real soldiers are out there doing the real work, and you're here, dressed up, holding a gun you've probably never even loaded, so tourists can take selfies with the failure they parked at the gate." That one had teeth. I saw a few people at the railing wince. It is one thing to call a man a statue. It is another to stand in front of a man in uniform and tell him he is a coward who was not good enough for the war. And still Vale did not move. His eyes did not so much as flick to the man. But I was close and I was watching, and I saw his jaw set, not clench. Nothing so dramatic, just settle, the way a foundation settles, taking a weight it was built to take. I did not know then that the influencer had just called a man a coward who had walked into more darkness than that boy would see in 10 lifetimes. I did not know that the real soldiers doing the real work, the influencer imagined were, some of them, alive because of the man he was mocking. I knew none of it, but I knew, watching Vale's jaw settle and hold, that I had been wrong about the emptiness. There was something behind the stillness, something enormous, and it was holding. The palace staffer and the tall gray visitor were perhaps 40 paces up the line by then, coming slowly on. The staffer's voice reached us in fragments. "And of course the West Colonnade is the oldest of the standing posts, sir, dating from." And the tall man walked with his hands clasped behind his back, looking at each guard in turn as he passed, a long, unhurried assessment that made the men he passed stand a fraction straighter without quite knowing why. I want to slow here and tell you what I later learned about that walk, because at the time I only saw a dignitary being given a tour, and the truth was something else entirely. Colonel Thorne Havard had not come to Harrogate to see the palace. He had seen the palace 100 times. He had come, the staffer would tell us afterward, on a matter of records, some question of old service files, a reconciliation of names that a bureaucracy performs decades late and calls housekeeping. The tour of the colonnade was a courtesy, a way to fill the hour while a clerk somewhere fetched a folder. He was walking the line to be polite. He was not expecting to find anything on it. But a man like Havard cannot walk a line of soldiers and merely be polite. 30 years of command had wired something into him that did not switch off for courtesy tour. He read men the way the rest of us read weather. And as he came down the West Colonnade in the late morning heat, past the young ones with their locked knees and their darting eyes, past Pell fighting a fly, past me, and I felt his gaze touch me and move on, weighing me and finding me exactly what I was, a boy in a red coat. He was reading and cataloging, and when he reached the post where the influencer was in full cruel flower, he stopped. He did not stop for the influencer. He stopped for the man the influencer was tormenting. I saw the colonel's eyes go to Vale, and I saw them do the thing eyes do when they recognize not a face but a quality, a stillness that is not the stillness of a statue, but the stillness of a weapon at rest. His gaze went over Vale the way a locksmith's hand goes over a lock, and then it stopped and fixed on a spot below the metal bar, on the small gray enameled pin shaped like a lance across an open hand, the pin I had seen 100 times and never asked about, and something happened in the colonel's stone face that I had not thought that face could do. It changed. Not much, but I was watching and I saw it. The seams around his eyes deepened. His clasped hands came apart behind his back. For one moment, one single moment in a man who had plainly not shown an unguarded thing to the world in longer than I had been alive, Colonel Thorne Havard looked as if the floor had shifted under him. The influencer, of course, saw none of this. He was too busy performing. "Oh, look," he crowed, catching sight of the tall gray figure now standing at the guard's shoulder. "You want a photo with the statue too? Get in line. Everybody wants a piece of the guy who does nothing. Go on, wave your hand in front of his face, he won't even." "Stop talking." The colonel did not raise his voice. He did not need to. There are men who have commanded so long that quiet from them carries further than any shout, and Havard was such a man. The two words came out flat and level and absolutely final, and the influencer stopped talking so abruptly it was almost comic, his mouth still open around the word he had been about to say. For a moment the only sound was the murmur of the crowd, which had begun, in that way crowds have, to sense that the spectacle had changed shape into something they had not come for and could not look away from. The colonel ignored the influencer entirely, as if the man had ceased to exist the instant he was told to be quiet, which, in the colonel's world, he had. He took a step closer to Vale's post, and he looked at the gray pin, and then he looked up into Vale's face, and he said, in a voice pitched for the two of them alone but which carried in the sudden hush all down the line, "That's a gray lancer." Vale's eyes came off the trees. I had never seen them do that. In 3 weeks I had never once seen Corporal Edran Vale break his forward gaze on his own post, not for the loud one, not for the influencer, not for anything. But now his eyes came down slowly, the way something long buried comes up, and they settled on the colonel's face, and for the space of a breath the two men simply looked at each other, and I understood, even I, 19 and ignorant, that I was watching two people recognize each other across a distance I could not see the far side of. "Yes, sir," Vale said. 2 words. The first 2 words I had ever heard him speak on post. His voice was low and even, and there was nothing in it that I could name, but the colonel heard something because the colonel's jaw tightened, and he was quiet for a moment, and then he said a name. "Vale," he said, not a question, "Edran Vale." "Yes, sir." The colonel closed his eyes, just for a second. A tall gray man in a plain dark suit, standing in the sun on the West Colonnade with a crowd of strangers watching, closing his eyes as if against something too bright or too heavy to look at directly. When he opened them again they were wet at the corners, and he made no move to hide it, and that, a man like that, unashamed of the water in his eyes in front of 100 strangers, that told me, more than anything that came after, that whatever this was, it was very large indeed. "I looked for you," the colonel said. "After, I looked for your name on every list they'd let me see. It wasn't on any of them." I was told there was no one to find. That was the arrangement, sir, Vale said. The influencer, recovering some of his nerve, made the profound mistake of speaking again. Sorry, what is this? He said, phone still up, still recording, unable even now to read the room he was standing in. Is this a bit? Are you two doing a bit? Because... Put the phone down, the colonel said, without turning his head. Before I have it taken from you and everything on it examined, and you spend the afternoon explaining to people less patient than I am why you were filming a soldier and calling him a coward. The influencer put the phone down. I need to stop the story here for a moment and tell you what a gray lancer is, because the word passed between Vale and the colonel like a password, and it meant nothing to me at the time, and it means everything to the story. I have pieced it together in the years since from Corliss, who knew more than he ever let on, from Vale himself, in the few things he told me later, from an old man in a records office who should not have told me anything and told me a little anyway, because he said I had the look of someone who needed to understand and would carry it decently. Here is what I can say. There was, some years before I was born into that red coat, a unit. It did not have a proud name or a banner or a place in any parade. It did not appear on the rolls that get read out. It was small, never more than a few dozen at any time, and it did the work that does not get spoken of, in the places that do not get named, the long, quiet, dangerous work of going first into the dark, so that others could follow into the light and never know how the way had been cleared. Reconnaissance, the records office man called it, and then he was quiet for a while, and then he said, that word covers a great deal it does not describe. They wore no insignia in the field for obvious reasons. But when a man had done a certain kind of thing, had gone into a certain kind of place and come back, or had done the thing that let others come back whether he did or not, he was given a token. Not a medal. Medals are public, and this unit was not. He was given a small gray enameled pin, no color to it, no shine, a slim lance laid across an open hand. The lance for the going first. The open hand for the ones the lance went first to protect. You wore it, if you wore it at all, tucked under the facing of your coat where it caught no light, because the whole meaning of the unit was that it caught no light. The men who knew what it was could count on the fingers of two hands. To everyone else it was a bit of gray nothing, a squadron token, a mannerism of an older man. The unit was disbanded, quietly, the way it had done everything after a particular operation. I do not know the details and I will not pretend to. I know only what the records man told me, in a low voice with the door shut, that on a certain night in a certain place, a plan came apart the way plans do, and men who should have died did not die, and the reason they did not die was one man who stayed behind in the dark to hold a thing open that had to be held open, and held it, alone, longer than any reasonable person would have believed a man could, so that the others could get clear. And that when the others got clear and turned to look for him, he was not there and could not be found and was written off and mourned and eventually filed away under the flat administrative word for a man who does not come home. That man was not written up for a medal because the operation did not exist, because the unit did not exist. That man got a gray pin sent, years later, through channels that themselves did not officially exist, to an address that did not officially connect to him, with no letter, because there was nothing that could be safely put in a letter. And that man, it turned out, had not died in the dark after all. He had gotten clear too, by a route no one had planned and no one had expected, and had come home to a country that had already grieved and buried and forgotten him, and had found that the simplest thing, the kindest thing, the only sane thing, was to let the forgetting stand, to not correct the record, to let the man who had held the dark open be dead, officially forever, and to become, instead, someone quiet and ordinary who could stand in the sun and be no one. He had put on a red coat. He had taken a post on a wall. He had become a ceremonial guard, a piece of furniture, a toy they wound up for the tourists, and he had stood his post for years, saying nothing, giving nothing, letting boys like me call him empty to his face, because the alternative, the correcting of the record, the pinning on of the truth, the becoming again of the man who had done the thing in the dark, was a weight he had decided alone that he would rather not pick back up. And the man now standing in front of him in a plain dark suit, with wet eyes and his hands come unclasped, was one of the men who had gotten clear, one of the ones the lance had gone first for. Colonel Thorne Havard had been a captain on that certain night, in that certain place, and he was alive to be a colonel because Edran Vale had stayed in the dark to hold it open, and he had spent the years since believing the man who saved him was dead, and mourning him, and looking for a name that was not on any list, and being told there was no one to find. Now, on the West Colonnade in the heat, in front of a crowd of strangers and a boy in a red coat who had called this man furniture, the colonel had found him. You will understand why the colonel's eyes were wet. I did not know all of this in the moment standing 2 posts down. I learned it later in pieces, but I knew, watching them, that it was something on this order. You do not need to know the details of a thing to feel its size. And the size of what stood between those 2 men in the sun was such that the whole restless crowd had gone still, and the influencer with his lowered phone had gone the particular gray-white of a man who has just understood, far too late, exactly whom he has been mocking. Sir, Vale said quietly, you shouldn't not hear. Shouldn't what? The colonel said. Say it, any of it, it's better as it is. The colonel looked at him for a long moment, and I watched an old officer wrestle, out loud in public, with the thing every good officer wrestles with sooner or later, the question of what is owed. What is owed to the record, to the truth, to the men who cannot speak for themselves, weighed against what is owed to the wishes of a man who has earned, more than anyone alive, the right to have his wishes honored. I have carried you as dead for 11 years, the colonel said at last, and his level voice cracked just slightly on the number. I have stood at a stone with your name spelled wrong on it, because they could not even get that right, and I have told myself the story every officer tells himself, that you knew the cost and paid it and it was not my fault, and I believed I would carry that stone to my own grave. And now you tell me you have been standing on a wall 4 miles from my office, letting children call you a mannequin for 11 years, and you want me to walk away and keep carrying the stone. He shook his head slowly. No, I will honor a great deal that you ask of me, Vale. I owe you more than a man can honor, but not that one. Vale said nothing. His eyes had gone back to the trees, not because he had lost interest, but because I think he could not hold the colonel's gaze and hold himself together at the same time, and a guardsman chooses the post over his own feelings every time, that being the whole of the trade. Sergeant Corliss arrived then. He had come down the line at a pace I had never seen Corliss move, a square gray man in a hurry, which was itself a thing worth the price of admission, and he stopped a respectful 2 paces off and drew himself up and did something that made the last of my old picture of the world fall off its nail and shatter on the flagstones. Corliss saluted Vale. Not the colonel, Vale. Our Sergeant Corliss, 30 years on the posts, a man who rationed respect by the syllable and had never in my memory given a corporal so much as a nod he did not have to, brought his hand up to the brim of his bearskin and held it there, rigid, correct, eyes front, and saluted a corporal in the sun in front of the whole crowd. And Vale, after a moment, returned it, and I will swear to this, I saw Corliss's chin tremble, one small betrayal in that granite face, before he mastered it. You knew, the colonel said to Corliss. It was not an accusation, it was almost gratitude. I knew there was a gray pin, sir, Corliss said low. I knew what a gray pin means. A man learns to know if he's on the posts long enough. I never asked him, you don't ask. He glanced at Vale, and 30 years of held-back feeling was in the glance. I've stood a lot of good men, Colonel. I've never stood a better. I put him on the West Colonnade because it's the hardest post we've got, most crowd, most heat, most fools. And I wanted him where I could see him take it, because watching him take it made me a better sergeant. I'm not ashamed to say it. I'd have told you sooner, but it wasn't mine to tell. I have thought about that a great deal since. I put him on the hardest post because watching him take it made me better. That is a whole philosophy of leadership in one sentence, and I got it for free at 19, standing 2 posts down, still mostly ashamed of myself. Because by now the shame had arrived in full. It had been arriving in pieces for 3 weeks, ever since Vale's eyes moved past the loud one to read the crowd, but it landed all at once now, watching Corliss's chin tremble, and it landed hard. Every joke I had made, furniture, wax dummy. You could put a dummy in that tunic. I had said those things about a man who had stayed alone in the dark, so that other men's children would grow up with fathers. I had called him empty. I had been so certain, with the awful certainty of the young, that a man who showed nothing had nothing, and I had been wrong in a way that made me feel I might be sick right there on the post, which of course I could not be, because I was a guardsman, and the one thing Vale had taught me, without ever meaning to teach me anything, was that you hold your post no matter what is happening inside you. So I held it and I watched. The influencer was still standing at the railing, and now the crowd had turned. That is the thing about a crowd. It will follow cruelty when cruelty is winning, and it will turn on cruelty the instant cruelty loses, and it does not feel a shred of responsibility for either move. A woman near the front had begun, quietly and then less quietly, to tell the people around her what she had gathered, that the tall man was some kind of colonel, that the guard the young man had been calling a coward was apparently a decorated soldier who had been thought dead, that the young man had been filming himself abusing a war hero and putting it out for strangers to admire. The story ran through the crowd the way fire runs through dry grass, changing and growing as it went, and the faces at the railing turned toward the influencer one by one, and there is no lonelier place in the world than the front of a crowd that has decided it is done with you. The influencer started. I mean, how was I supposed to know? He didn't say anything, he just stood there. If he'd said something. He is not permitted to say anything, the colonel said, and now he did turn, and he looked at the influencer for the first time, and it was not a warm look. That is the post, that is what the red coat means. He stands and he takes whatever the day brings, and he does not answer, because the moment he answers he is no longer a guardsman, he is just a man in an argument, and the crown does not station men in arguments at its gate. You looked at a person who had voluntarily given up the right to defend himself, and you decided that made him safe to attack. There is a word for people who choose their targets that way. I will let you find it on your own time. The influencer had nothing. There is nothing to say to that, and to his small credit some part of him seemed to know it. His phone hung at his side. His audience of strangers had melted back into the general crowd, wanting no part of what he had become, and he stood alone at the railing, 24 years old and famous for the afternoon for exactly the wrong thing, and I felt no pity for him, and I have felt a little since, because I know now that he was, in his way, only a louder version of what I had been. He had said out loud what I had thought quietly. The difference between us was a phone and a few degrees of nerve, and I have never let myself forget it. "What happens now, sir?" Corliss asked the colonel quietly, guardsman to officer, the practical question under all the feeling, because something was going to happen now. You could feel it. A thing this size does not get discovered and then simply folded back up and put away. The record had a stone with a man's name spelled wrong on it, and the man was standing in the sun 4 miles from the office of the officer he had saved, and the machinery of a whole institution was, whether Vale wished it or not, about to grind into motion. The colonel was quiet for a moment. He looked at Vale, who was looking at the trees, and when he spoke, it was gently, the gentleness of a hard man that is somehow harder to bear than his hardness. "Now," the colonel said, "I make some calls, and you, Corporal, are going to have to decide something you have spent 11 years arranging not to have to decide." Because I can walk away from this post and say nothing, if that is truly what you want, and no one will ever know. And you can stand here in the sun until you're old and let boys call you a mannequin, and it will be a kind of peace, and I will understand it. God help me, better than most men could. He paused. Or you can let the record be corrected. You can let the men who are alive because of you know that you are alive. You can let a certain officer stop carrying a stone. It is your right to refuse. It has always been your right. But I am asking you, old friend, one time and then never again, not to refuse. And Corporal Edran Vale, ceremonial guard, furniture, toy soldier, the emptiest man I had ever been so certain about, stood on his post in the heat with the whole afternoon hanging on his answer, and said nothing at all. Because he did not yet know, and a man who does not know does not lie. That, too, I learned from him, standing 2 posts down, learning things I had not asked to learn from a man I had spent 3 weeks insulting. The colonel made his calls that afternoon. I know this only from the aftershocks, which reached us the way tremors reach the far edge of a floor. By the change of the evening watch, there were staff on the colonnade, who did not usually come to the colonnade, quiet men and women in dark clothes who spoke to Corliss in low voices, and looked at Vale's post and wrote things down. By the next morning there was a man from the palace records office, and a man who did not say where he was from at all, and a great deal of standing about and murmuring at the north end of the line. And Vale stood his post through all of it, unmoved, giving nothing, as if the machinery grinding into motion 4 miles away and 40 feet away were happening to some other man entirely. I want to be honest about what the discovery cost him, because it would be a lie to tell you it was all vindication and glory, and Vale would not thank me for the lie. It cost him the thing he had built. That is what I understood watching him those next days. For 11 years he had constructed, with enormous patience, a life in which he was no one, a corporal on a wall, a quiet man in a barracks, a person with no history that anyone needed to ask about. And the reason he had built it, I came to understand, was not modesty and not even the security arrangement, though the arrangement was real. The reason was simpler and heavier than that. He told me a little of it later, on a cold night near the end of the summer, in the way men will sometimes tell a thing to a younger man precisely, because the younger man does not fully matter and so is safe to tell. He said that on the certain night in the certain place, when he stayed behind in the dark to hold the thing open, he had not expected to come home. He had made his peace with not coming home. A man can do that, he said. It is not as hard as you would think, when the alternative is watching men you are responsible for not come home instead. He had said his goodbyes inside himself and become, in his own mind, a dead man doing a dead man's last useful work. And then, by the route no one had planned, he had lived. You would think that's the good part, he said to me, looking out at the dark parade ground. Living, and it is, don't mistake me, but there's a thing that happens to a man who's said his goodbyes and then doesn't get to leave. Something in you already walked out the door. You spend the rest of it half a step behind yourself, watching a man you thought was finished keep on going. Everyone treats you like you came back, but you know a part of you didn't. And the strange grace of it, the mercy, was being no one, being furniture. A ceremonial guard nobody looked at twice. It let the part of me that came home be quiet. It let me stand still and not have to be the man who did the thing, because the man who did the thing died in the dark and I was glad to let him. Do you see? Being called empty wasn't the insult you thought it was. Some days it was the only rest I got. I have never forgotten that. I was 19 and had called a man furniture, and he sat with me in the cold and explained, without a shred of blame, that being called furniture had sometimes been the kindest thing that happened to him all day. I do not know that I have ever felt smaller or been given a larger gift than in that one exchange. But I am ahead of the story again, back to the days of the grinding machinery. The complication, and there is always a complication, the false middle where a good thing threatens to curdle, was that once a matter of this kind is discovered, it stops belonging to the men it concerns. The colonel had promised Vale that he could still refuse, that the choice was his, and the colonel meant it with his whole heart. But the colonel was one man and the machinery was many, and the machinery does not love a man's private wishes. There were people, once the story climbed high enough, who saw in Edran Vale not a friend restored from the dead but an opportunity, a hero, a story, a guardsman who was secretly a decorated operator thought killed in action, standing his post in humble anonymity for 11 years. Do you have any idea, one of the dark-clothed people was heard to say, what that does for us? For morale, for the public, for the whole institution. They wanted to bring him forward. They wanted a ceremony. They wanted the gray pin turned into a bright metal and pinned on in the sun with cameras present, the very thing the gray pin existed in order never to be. They wanted, in short, to take the man's greatest wound and put it on a poster. And Vale, who had refused to defend himself against a boy with a phone, now had to defend himself against something far larger and far better dressed, and he could not do it the way he had done everything for 11 years, which was by standing still and saying nothing. Standing still and saying nothing was, this time, going to hand him straight to them. That was the shape of the middle of it. The truth was out. The men he had saved knew he lived. Corliss had saluted him and the colonel had wept, and all of that was right and good. But the same truth that gave him back to his friends threatened to take from him the one mercy he had built for himself, and to do it in the name of honoring him, which is the cruelest way a good thing can go wrong. I did not know how it would turn. For several days none of us did. Vale stood his post. The machinery ground. The colonel came back twice more, and I could see from his face that the calls he was making were not all going the way he wanted, that forces above his rank had gotten hold of the thing and were pulling it in a direction he did not like. And on the fourth day, word came down the line, passed sergeant to sergeant in the flat voice sergeants use for news that is above their pay, that the matter had gone all the way up. All the way up, to the top of the house itself. King Alaric wished to see the guard from the West Colonnade. I was not in the room. I want to be clear about that because what happened in the room is the hinge of the whole story, and I would not have you think I saw it with my own eyes. I have it from the colonel who was there, and from Corliss who had it from the colonel, and from Vale himself who told me the smallest and truest piece of it on that cold night near the end of the summer. Between the three accounts I am confident of the shape, and I will give it to you as faithfully as I can, and where I am guessing I will say so. They took Vale off the post on the 5th morning and cleaned him up, as if he needed cleaning. The man was never anything but immaculate, and walked him through corridors he had guarded the outer walls of for 11 years and never once entered, and brought him to a room I have never seen and will only describe as everyone describes it, high and quiet and full of a weight that has nothing to do with the furniture. And King Alaric was there, and the colonel was there. And 2 or 3 of the dark-clothed people were there, the ones who wanted the ceremony and the poster, standing along the wall with the patient look of people who believe the outcome is already decided in their favor and are merely waiting for the formalities. The king, by every account, was not what the dark-clothed people expected. I have learned in a long life spent near the house that the people who serve a throne often understand the throne worse than the person on it. The dark-clothed people had a plan for Vale, and the plan assumed that the king would want what institutions want, the story, the morale, the useful hero. They had, I think, forgotten that Alaric had himself worn a uniform before he wore a crown, and that a man who has stood a post knows things about standing a post that cannot be explained to a man who has only ever commissioned them. The king had Vale's file. Or rather, he had the thin, strange, mostly empty thing that stood in for Vale's file, the record with the holes in it where a life had been deliberately unwritten. He had the colonel's account. He had, I am told, sat for some time simply reading, while the dark-clothed people waited and Vale stood at attention in the center of the room, and the colonel stood off to one side with his heart in his mouth. And then the king looked up and looked at Vale for a long moment and said, This is the part Vale told me himself, word for word, and I believe it is the only part of the whole affair he treasured, the king said. They tell me you would rather I did none of this. Yes, your majesty, Vale said. Tell me why. And here the colonel said, the dark-clothed people stirred, because this was not the script. The script was that the king would thank the hero and announce the ceremony, and everyone would applaud. The script did not have a place in it for the king asking the hero why he did not want to be a hero, and it certainly did not have a place for the king leaning forward to hear the answer. Vale was quiet for a moment. Then he said, and I have this from the colonel, who said Vale spoke as plainly as a man reading a list, because the pin is gray for a reason, sir. Everything I did that mattered, I did on the understanding that it would never be seen. That was the whole of the thing, not the danger, the unseenness. There were men who could do what I did, and there were men who could do what I did and never need anyone to know, and the second kind were the only kind that unit could use, because the moment the work is seen, it stops working and men start dying. I gave 11 years to being no one. I did it partly because I was ordered to, and partly because it was the only way I could live with having lived. If you pin a bright medal on me in the sun, sir, with the cameras there, you will be honoring the exact opposite of the thing I actually did. You will be telling the whole realm that the way to reward a man who spent his life staying invisible is to make him permanently visible. And every young man watching who has it in him to do the gray work will learn the lesson that the gray work ends in a poster. Some of them will do it anyway because they're the right kind, but some of them will do it for the poster. And the ones who do it for the poster are the ones who get their people killed. The room, the colonel said, was very quiet. I am not refusing to be thanked, Vale went on. I would not presume. If your majesty wishes to thank me, I have been thanked already this week, more than a man has any right to. My old captain wept in the sun over me, and my sergeant saluted me, and a boy who called me furniture cannot look me in the eye any more. And if you want to know the truth, sir, that boy's shame is worth more to me than any medal, because it means he learned something he'll carry, and carried things are the only honors that last. I have had my thanks. What I am asking, the only thing I am asking, is to be allowed to go back to my wall and be no one again. Correct the stone if you like. Spell the name right. Let the men who need to know that I lived be told, quietly, one, by people they trust. But let it be gray. Let it stay gray. That is the honor. Anything brighter is a wound with a ribbon on it. I have quoted that at length because I have never in my life heard a better argument from anyone on any subject, and because it turned the whole matter, and because a 19-year-old boy who had called this man empty deserved, I think, to eventually learn exactly how full he was, and to write it down so that it would not be lost. The king was silent for a while. Then the colonel said he rose, and when the king of a house rises in a room, everyone in the room understands that a thing has been decided, though no one yet knows what. Colonel Havard, the king said, you told me this man saved your life and the lives of others, and that you carried him as dead for 11 years. Is that so? It is, your majesty. And now that you have him back, what do you want for him? Not what the house wants, not what these good people along the wall want. You, the man who owes him, what do you want? And the colonel, who had come into that summer wanting the truth corrected, and the record set right, and some form of justice done, looked at his old friend standing at attention in the center of the room, asking only to be left gray, and made the hardest turn a proud man can make, which is the turn away from his own idea of justice toward another man's idea of peace. I want what he wants, your majesty, the colonel said. I spent 11 years thinking the thing I owed him was to make sure he was remembered. Standing here, I understand I had it backwards. The thing I owe him is to make sure he is left alone. I would give a great deal to pin that medal on him myself, but it would be for me, not for him. He has told us plainly what he needs, and the least a grateful man can do is believe him. The dark-clothed people along the wall did not like this at all. One of them began to speak, something about morale, about the public good, about a wasted opportunity, and got, I am told, 3 words into it before the king raised one hand, not sharply, just enough, and the man stopped. The opportunity, the king said quietly, is to prove that this house can be trusted with a man's silence. That is not a small opportunity. That is the only opportunity that matters. A realm that cannot keep faith with the men who serve it in the dark will not have men who serve it in the dark for very long. We will do this Corporal Vale's way. And so it was done Vale's way, which is to say it was very nearly not done at all, which is to say it was done exactly right. There was no ceremony in the sun. There were no cameras. The gray pin stayed gray and stayed tucked under the facing of the tunic where it caught no light. The story that the dark-clothed people had wanted to hang on a poster was instead quietly buried again, so thoroughly that within a season the crowds at the West Colonnade had no idea that the corporal at the 4th post had ever been anything but a corporal at the 4th post. That, I have come to see, was the whole point. The measure of whether the house had truly done right by Vale was whether, a year later, no one could tell that it had done anything at all. But some things were done quietly, and I know of them, and I will tell you, because they are the resolution and they are the reason I have carried this story for so long. The stone was corrected. There was, it turned out, an actual stone, a memorial marker in a quiet place, with Vale's name on it spelled wrong, exactly as the colonel had said. The king did not have it removed, which would have raised questions, and did not have it corrected in any way a stranger would notice. But the name was set right. And beneath it, where before there had been the flat, dishonest word for a man written off, there was set instead a single line, agreed between the king and the colonel and Vale himself. That means everything to the few who know how to read it and nothing to anyone else. It reads, he held the door. I have stood before that stone. I will not tell you where it is, but I will tell you that 4 words have never carried more. The men who were alive because of Vale were told. Not all at once, not in a press release, but one by one quietly by people they trusted, exactly as Vale had asked. I am told there were a number of them, more than the colonel, more than I would have guessed, scattered across the years and the world, ordinary men now with ordinary lives, who had spent a decade believing the man who held the door had died holding it. And each of them, in his own time and his own way, was allowed to learn that he had not. I do not know what those men did with the knowledge. I know only that a man deserves to know whether the person who saved his life is above the ground or beneath it, and that for 11 years these men had been denied that plain human thing, and that the denial was mended, one quiet conversation at a time, in the only way that could not undo the very silence it honored. And the colonel was given his own small mercy, which he had earned by giving up the larger one. He was permitted quietly, off the books, on his own time, to visit. He came to the West Colonnade now and then, not as a colonel inspecting, but as an old man visiting an old friend, and he would stand for a while at the railing among the tourists, an unremarkable gray gentleman, and watch Vale hold his post, and say nothing, and Vale would give him nothing, eyes forward, the way he gave everyone nothing. And to any stranger it looked like an old man admiring the famous guards. But I knew, and Corliss knew, and the 2 of them knew, that it was 2 soldiers keeping a watch together across a railing, one on his post and one restored to him, and that the nothing passing between them was the fullest thing on the whole colonnade. The king did one more thing, and it is the thing that told me most about King Alaric, and I will set it down carefully. He came to the post. Not with an entourage, not with cameras, not on any announced occasion. On an ordinary gray morning some weeks after the audience, King Alaric walked the West Colonnade the way his ancestors had once walked their own lines, with a single aid and no fuss, and the tourists at the railing did not know him out of his usual settings and paid him no mind, which I think pleased him enormously. He walked the line slowly, and he stopped at the fourth post, in front of Corporal Edran Vale, and he did not speak, because to speak would have broken Vale's post and drawn eyes and undone the whole careful gray business. He simply stood there for a moment, the king of the house, in front of the guard the crowd called furniture. And then this I did see, because I was on the post 2 down, and I will testify to it until I die. The king, very slightly, so slightly that no tourist caught it, inclined his head. A small bow, the smallest possible bow, a king to a corporal. And Vale, who could not return it without breaking his post, did the only thing a guardsman on his post can do, which is nothing, eyes forward, the trees and the far gate and the discipline holding. But I was close, and I saw his throat move once, and I understood that the man who had not been moved by the loud one, or the influencer, or the heat, or 11 years of being called empty had been moved, at last, by a small bow no one was meant to see. Because that was the honor pitched exactly to his frequency. Gray, unseen, between 2 men who understood. The king had listened to every word Vale said in that high, quiet room, and had grasped the thing the dark-clothed people never would, and had found the one way to thank a man for a lifetime of invisibility, by honoring him invisibly. The king straightened and walked on down the line and was gone, and the tourists went on photographing a corporal who they believed had just been passed by an unremarkable gentleman, and none of them knew that they had witnessed the truest ceremony that ever took place on that ground. I did, though. I saw it, and I have spent the rest of my life trying to be worth having seen it. But I have run ahead again and left out things that belong to the telling, and I will go back now and fill them, because a story like this is not only its grand hinges, it is also its small hours, and the small hours are where a boy actually changes, and I promised you at the start that this was my story too. Let me go back to the influencer, because I owe him a fairer accounting than my 19-year-old self would have given. He was not arrested. There was, in the end, nothing to arrest him for. Standing at a railing and being cruel to a man who will not answer is not against any law, which is precisely the thing that makes the West Colonnade the test it is. But the afternoon did not let him go unmarked, and the marking of him is a small parable in itself, and I will set it down. He had, of course, been recording the whole time, and the crowd had been recording him. That is the arrangement of the modern world at the railing, everyone filming everyone, 100 small, unblinking eyes. And so within a day there were clips, but they were not the clips he had wanted. He had come to the colonnade to make a clip of himself being clever at the expense of a mannequin, and he went home the subject of 100 clips of himself calling a decorated soldier a coward moments before a colonel arrived, and without raising his voice, took him apart. The word he had used as a weapon, ceremonial, came back on him as a verdict. Strangers who had never met him decided, on the strength of 90 seconds of video, exactly what kind of man he was, and told him so, at length, with the particular cruelty the crowd reserves for those it has appointed to punish. There is a grim symmetry in it that I have never quite been able to enjoy and have never quite been able to look away from. He had wanted the crowd's attention. He got it. It is not a thing I would wish on anyone, and I say that as someone who watched him earn it in front of my eyes. I saw him once more, weeks later, and this is the part I have never told anyone and will tell now because I am old, and it seems wrong to keep it. He came back to the colonnade. Not with a phone, not with an audience. He came on a quiet weekday, alone in plain clothes, and he stood at the railing in front of Vale's post for a long time, saying nothing, doing nothing, just standing, the way the decent ones sometimes stand. And I watched him from 2 posts down and did not know what he meant to do and half braced for him to make some new trouble. But he did not make trouble. He stood there until the light started to go, and the crowd thinned, and then he did a thing I did not expect. He took something out of his pocket and set it on the flagstone at the base of the railing, gently, the way you set down something that matters, and he stepped back, and he stood at a kind of clumsy attention for a moment. A young man who had never been taught how, doing his best imitation of the posture of the man he had insulted, and then he turned and walked away, and I never saw him again. When the watch changed, I went and looked at what he had left. It was a folded note. I did not open it. It was not mine to open, and Corliss took it, and I never learned what it said. But I have wondered all these years, and my best guess is that it was the closest thing a boy like that had to the thing I was, at that very moment, also trying to find my own clumsy way toward. An apology, not to be admired, not for the crowd, just left at the base of a railing for a man who would never read it, because some things you have to say even when they can't be heard, or they rot in you. I understood him better after that. I understood that he was not a villain. He was a boy who had done a cruel thing loudly and been caught, and had gone quiet, and had come back. And the only difference between his story and mine was that I had done my cruel thing more quietly and had not been caught by anyone but myself. That is a thin difference. I have never let it make me feel superior to him. If anything, it has made me gentle with the cruel young, because I know now that cruelty in the young is very often just a fear of what understanding would cost, and that the same boy who calls a man furniture on Thursday may leave a folded note at his feet on a Tuesday 3 weeks later, if someone shows him what he mocked. Which brings me to my own reckoning, which I have been circling this whole time, and which I will now stop circling. I had to say it to him. That was the thing I knew in the days after the colonel came, with a certainty that would not let me sleep. I had called this man empty to his face. He had heard me. I had made sure he heard me. That had been the whole point back when I was a fool with an audience of one named Pell. And now I knew what he was, and the knowledge sat in me like a stone I could not put down, and I understood that the only way to put it down was to pick it up in front of him and own it, out loud, and take whatever he gave me back. It took me 11 days to find the nerve. I have always thought there was a rightness in that number, though it was only chance. 11 days for me to face a small thing, 11 years for him to carry a large one. I do not compare them to flatter myself. I compare them to remind myself, whenever I am tempted to think I have suffered, of the actual proportions of things. I found him on the cold night I have mentioned, the one near the end of the summer, when the heat had finally broken, and the parade ground lay dark and empty under a sky with some stars in it. He was outside the barracks, alone, doing nothing, which I had learned by then was itself a rare and telling thing, because Vale was almost never doing nothing. A man who is always half a step behind himself keeps his hands busy so the gap doesn't show. But that night he was still, looking out at the dark, and I made myself walk up beside him, and I stood there for a while not knowing how to start, the way you do. "I need to say something to you," I said finally, "and I need you to not make it easy because I don't deserve it easy." He did not look at me, but he did not walk away either. "Say it then," he said. "I called you furniture," I said. "I called you a wax dummy. I told the whole barracks you were empty, that they could put a mannequin in your tunic and no one would know the difference. I said it where you could hear it. I said it because I thought a man who showed nothing had nothing, and I was so sure, and I was wrong, and I've been sick about it since the day the colonel came, and I know that being sick about it doesn't fix anything, but I couldn't stand another day of you not having heard me say I know what I am." I ran out of breath. My eyes were stinging, which I hated. "I'm sorry, that's all. I'm sorry, Corporal." He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that I thought maybe he was going to give me the nothing he gave everyone, and I told myself I would deserve it, and I braced for it. Then he said, still looking at the dark, "Do you know what the hardest part of the post is? Not the heat, not the fools. The hardest part is that the fools are usually right about the small thing and wrong about the large one. You looked at me and saw a man showing nothing, and you were right. I was showing nothing. That part you had dead to rights. Where you went wrong was thinking the nothing was the whole of me. But that's not a stupid mistake, son. That's the mistake the post is designed to produce. That's what it's for. It shows the world nothing, and lets the world decide what the nothing means, and the kind of person a man is comes out in what he decides. He turned his head then and looked at me for the first time, and there was no anger in his face, and somehow that was harder to bear than anger would have been. "You decided it meant empty," he said, "and then when you learned better you couldn't live with having decided it, and it took you 11 days to walk out here and stand in the cold and say so to a corporal who could have just let you stew." A very small thing happened at the corner of his mouth. On any other man it would not have counted as a smile, but on Vale it was practically an embrace. That's the whole of it right there. That's the only test that ever mattered. The loud one failed it. The one with the phone failed it, and then I hear came back and half passed it, which is more than most. And you failed it and then walked out here in the cold. Do you understand what I'm telling you? I don't hold the joke against you. I never did. I held my breath to see what you'd do about the joke, and you did this. He nodded once slowly. "Apology accepted, guardsman. Now go to bed. You have the early watch, and a man who apologizes at midnight and stands his post poorly at dawn hasn't apologized for anything." I went to bed. I stood my post at dawn better than I had ever stood it, and something in me had changed shape in the cold on the parade ground, quietly, the way the important changes come, and it has never changed back. There is one more scene from that summer I must give you, because it is the one that taught me what all the rest of it was for, and because it happened after the reveal, when the crowds had forgotten again, and Vale was once more just the corporal at the fourth post, and it proved that the lesson was not a single grand afternoon, but a thing you carry into every ordinary day after. It was late summer, the crowds thinning as the season turned, and a new provoker came to the railing. They never stopped coming. That is the nature of the post. This one was an older woman with an expensive scarf and a loud grievance about a photograph she had wanted and not gotten, and she took it out on Vale the way people take their disappointments out on the nearest thing that will not fight back. She called him rude. She called him useless. She said, and I remember the exact words because of what they set off in me, "You just stand there. Anyone could do your job. It takes nothing. It means nothing." And I felt the old anger rise in me, the protective anger of a young man who now knew who he was standing next to, the terrible wish to lean over and say to her, "Do you have any idea? Do you have the faintest idea who this is?" I wanted to hand her the whole story. I wanted to watch her face fall the way the influencers had fallen. I wanted, God forgive me, the pleasure of the reveal, the pleasure of watching arrogance meet the truth and shatter. And I did not do it. Because I had learned from Vale that the reveal is not the point, and that a man who needs the arrogant to be humbled in order to feel that his own service has meaning has not understood service at all. The gray pin is gray for a reason. The honor that needs an audience is not honor. It is applause wearing honor's coat. Vale did not need this woman to know who he was. Vale did not need anyone to know who he was. He needed only to stand his post correctly in the sun and the cold, for whoever came, cruel or kind, and to let his stillness mean whatever the person looking at it chose to make it mean, and to be, quietly, invisibly, at enormous and unrewarded cost, the kind of man whose stillness, if you ever did learn the truth of it, would break your heart. So I stood my own post, and I gave the woman with the scarf nothing, exactly as Vale gave her nothing, and after a while she wore herself out and moved on, and never knew, and it did not matter that she never knew, and understanding that it did not matter was the last thing that summer taught me and the most important. That is the difference, I think, between the hidden elite story as the crowd loves to tell it and the hidden elite truth as I lived beside it. The crowd wants the reveal. The crowd wants the toy soldier unmasked, the arrogant undone, the medal that was secretly there all along held up to the light at last. It is a satisfying shape, and I do not blame anyone for loving it. But the deeper thing, the thing Vale was, the thing the king understood and the dark-clothed people did not, is that the truest hidden elite are the ones who do not want the reveal at all, who would rather stay gray, who did the thing precisely so that it would never be a thing, and who experienced the unmasking not as vindication, but as a small ongoing wound, borne with grace, for the sake of others who are safer in a world where such men exist and are not seen. I served 14 more years on the posts after that summer. I rose in time. I made corporal and then sergeant, and I stood the West Colonnade myself in the last of it, and I put my own young fools on the hardest post so that watching them take it would make me a better sergeant, exactly as Corliss had done with Vale, exactly as I finally understood he had meant it. And whenever I caught a new boy, and there was always a new boy making the old joke, calling some quiet older guardsman furniture, deciding that a man who showed nothing had nothing, I did not shout at him. I took him aside on a cold night when the parade ground was dark, and I told him a story. I told him this story. Not all the details, some of them were not mine to tell, and some of them I had sworn to keep gray, and I have kept them gray in every telling but this last one, which I set down now because I am old and the men in it are gone, and it seems to me that a thing this good should not die entirely with the last man who saw it. But I told him the shape of it. A man they called furniture, a colonel who wept in the sun, a gray pin that caught no light, a king who bowed where no one could see, and a boy who called a hero empty and spent the rest of his life learning what full meant. And I would end it always with the thing Vale said to me on the cold night, because it is the whole of what I know and the best of what I have to give. But before I set that down, there are two people I have not yet given their due, and this telling would be dishonest without them, and so I will give them their due now in the last of my ink. The first is Pell. Pell, who laughed at everything I said. Pell, who slept the sleep of the untroubled while I lay awake with my splinter of doubt. I have been hard on my 19-year-old self in this telling, and rightly, but I have let Pell off, and that is only because Pell was easier company for my conscience than I was. The truth is that Pell was there for all of it, and Pell laughed at all of it, and Pell was, if anything, quicker with the cruelty than I was, because Pell had the gift of never once wondering whether he might be wrong. When the colonel came and the story broke, and the whole barracks learned what the corporal at the 4th post had been, Pell did a thing I have thought about for a long time. Pell was delighted. Not ashamed, delighted. Overnight Pell became the man who had known Vale, who had bunked down the row from a war hero, who could tell you, and told everyone at length, what Vale was really like, as though the two of them had been comrades rather than a stranger and a boy who had mocked him in his hearing. Pell did not feel the stone I felt. Pell felt only the reflected shine. The reveal, for Pell, was a lottery ticket that had come good. He had happened to be standing near greatness when greatness was unmasked, and he intended to spend the proximity for all it was worth. I do not tell you this to condemn Pell. Pell was not cruel by nature, he was only shallow, and there is a great deal of Pell in most of us. But the contrast taught me something. Two boys heard the same revelation, and one lay awake and one saw a lottery ticket, and the difference was not intelligence and not even decency. It was whether the truth of another man cost us anything. For me it cost my certainty, my sleep, 11 days of nerve, a great deal of shame I have never fully set down. For Pell it cost nothing. It was free treasure, and I have come to believe that this is the real dividing line between people, deeper than kind and cruel, whether the reality of another human being is something you pay for or something you spend. Vale had paid in the dark more than any of us. Pell wanted to spend the paying. I stood for the first time in my life somewhere between and chose, barely, clumsily, 11 days late to pay. Pell left the guards within a year or two, off to some brighter thing, and I lost track of him, and I suspect he told the story of the war hero he bunked with for the rest of his life, and never once mentioned the joke about the wax dummy, because in Pell's version there was no joke, there was only Pell near greatness always. That is not the worst way for a man to move through the world, but it is not Vale's way, and it is not, I hope, mine. The second person I owe is Corliss. I have told you that Corliss saluted Vale in the sun, and that his chin trembled, and that he had put Vale on the hardest post to make himself a better sergeant. But I have not told you the thing Corliss said to me at the very end of that summer, when I was packing to move to a new posting, and came to say goodbye to the square gray man who had had charge of the most important weeks of my life, without either of us knowing it at the time. I thanked him. I did not know quite how to say what I was thanking him for, and I fumbled it, the way you do, and Corliss let me fumble and then cut me off the way he cut everything off, one syllable at a time. "Don't thank me," he said. "I didn't do anything. I stood a good man on a wall and watched a foolish boy figure out he was foolish. That's the whole of my career, if you want to know. Standing good men on walls and watching foolish boys figure it out." He looked at me for a moment with those flat gray eyes that had seen 30 years of the posts. "You know what the West Colonnade is, guardsman. It's a mirror, that's all it is. A man comes to that railing and there's a soldier standing there showing him nothing, and the man looks into the nothing and sees himself. The kind ones see a person they ought to respect. The cruel ones see something to break. The frightened ones see somewhere safe. Vale never had to do a thing. He just had to be still enough to be a mirror and let every fool and every saint who came to that railing meet themselves in him." He nodded slowly. "That's what he was doing for 11 years, whether he meant to or not, holding up a mirror. And most people didn't like what they saw, which is why most people were unkind to him, because people are always unkind to the mirror that shows them small. You were unkind to him because he showed you small. And then one day you looked again and saw yourself true, and you didn't like it, and instead of breaking the mirror, you fixed the man looking into it. That's the only thing that's ever mattered on that wall. Now get out of here before I have to feel something." I got out of there. But I have never forgotten it, the wall as a mirror, the still man showing every passerby their own face, the cruelty of the crowd as nothing but people flinching from what the mirror showed them. It is the truest thing anyone ever told me about the post, and about people, and I have tested it against 40 years of watching human beings behave at railings, and it has never once failed. The man who mocks the still guard is telling you everything about himself and nothing about the guard. I know, because I was that man, and the mockery was a full and honest confession, and it took a colonel and a gray pin and a cold night on a dark parade ground to teach me to read my own confession back. Edran Vale served out his years on the West Colonnade and grew old on it, and stood his last post the way he had stood his first, giving the world nothing and being to those few who knew everything. He never took the bright medal. The gray pin stayed gray to the end. And when at last he did leave the post, not carried off in any drama, just an old guardsman reaching the end of his service, he went the way he had wanted from the beginning, quietly, unremarked. No cameras. A corporal stepping off a wall for the final time while the tourists photographed the changing of the watch, and had no idea that anything worth photographing had just occurred. I was there for it as it happened. By then I was the sergeant, and it fell to me to stand the last inspection of the man who had, without ever meaning to, made me whatever I turned out to be worth. I walked the line, and I came to his post, and I lingered my half-second there the way Corliss had once lingered at that same post, and I understood, finally and completely, what the half-second had always meant. It was the only salute the arrangement allowed, a held breath in front of a man too great to be honored openly and too disciplined to accept the honor if you tried. I gave him my half-second. His eyes stayed on the trees, and then the watch changed, and he stepped off the wall, and it was over, and the world went on not knowing. The colonel outlived him by a few years, and I went to see the old man once, near his own end, and we sat together and did not say very much, two men who had both loved the same quiet, impossible corporal from different distances. Before I left, the colonel took my hand, and he said the thing that I have decided will be the end of this account, because it is the truest verdict anyone ever passed on the whole affair, and it deserves the last word more than anything I could write myself. "They mocked him as a ceremonial guard," the old colonel said, "and do you know the joke of it? He was one. That was exactly what he was. He gave up the loud honors and the bright medals and stood on a wall in a red coat and let the world call him a decoration, And that choosing of the small honor over the large, that willingness to be thought empty by everyone in order to be truly full in front of no one, that is the most ceremonial thing a man can do. He wasn't pretending to be a ceremonial guard while secretly being a hero. He was being the highest kind of ceremonial guard there is. The ceremony he kept was the ceremony of staying gray, and it is the only ceremony I have ever seen that was worth the whole of a man's life. I have never found anything to add to that, and I will not try now. I set this down late in an old man's hand, so that when the last of us who saw it is gone, there will still be a page somewhere that says, "There was a man they called Furniture, and a colonel recognized a small gray pin, and it turned out the emptiest seeming man on the wall had been the fullest all along, and had chosen the emptiness on purpose, and paid for it in silence, and asked in return only to be left alone to keep on paying." That is the whole of the story. The gray pin caught no light, and neither did the man, and that was the honor, and I understand it now, and I am sorry it took me so long, and I am glad, more glad than I can say, that I stood 2 posts down on the morning the colonel came, and saw the eyes come off the trees, and learned at 19 what a man is really made of, which is never what he shows you, and is measured always and only by what you decide the nothing means. I decided wrong once, and then I decided again. And deciding again, on a cold night in front of a man who let me, that was the making of me. Everything good I ever did on the posts after, I owe to a corporal I called Empty, who was kind enough to let me learn otherwise, and disciplined enough never to make it easy, and great enough to want, at the end of it all, nothing more than his gray wall and his silent watch, and the mercy of being no one at all. He held the door. 4 words on a stone in a quiet place. It is enough. It was always going to have to be enough. And the man it belongs to would tell you, if he ever told you anything, that it was already far more than he ever asked.